Hi there, this is Eshu. I'm the abbot here at Zenwest Buddhist Society. This Living Zen-podcast is just one of the many resources we've created at Zenwest to make Zen practice and training more available and accessible to people all over the world. Instructional videos, printable resources, and much, much more are also available on our website at www.zenwest.ca. If you're a regular listener, I'd love to hear from you. So please drop me an email at office@zenwest.ca and let me know who you are, how you got started, and what brought you to Zen. Everything we make available in person and online at Zenwest is only possible because of the support of our members and associates, people like you. If the efforts of our community are making a difference in your life, I'd like to invite you to show your support and take part in making it happen by becoming an associate or member of the Zenwest Sangha. You can do this by clicking the Join Us tab on our website at www.zenwest.ca. Thank you for your support, and thanks for listening. Today we'll be continuing with Case 3 of the Gateless Barrier, Wumenguan. Juzhi raises one finger. Whenever Juzhi was asked a question, he simply raised one finger. One day, a visitor asked Juzhi's attendant what his master preached. The boy raised a finger. Hearing of this, Juzhi cut off the boy's finger with a knife. As he ran from the room, screaming with pain, Juzhi called to him. When he turned his head, Juzhi raised a finger. The boy was suddenly awakened. When Juzhi was about to die, he said to his assembled monks, "I received this one-finger Zen from Tianlong. I used it all my life, but never used it up." With this, he entered into his eternal rest. Wumen says, the awakening of Juzhi and the boy has nothing to do with the end of a finger. If you realize this, then Tianlong, Juzhi, the boy, and you yourself are all run through with a single skewer. Wumen's verse. Tianlong made a fool of old Juzhi, who cut the boy with a sharp blade. Just as the deity Zuling raised his hand, and Huashan, with its many ridges, split in two. 3 bells, please. This is one of the great koans in the Zen tradition. Whenever I hear people criticizing Islam or criticizing Christianity or the Torah for violence, and I get the impression that they think that Buddhism is clean of this kind of stuff, I always kind of roll my eyes and think of Juzhi or Nansen cutting the cat in two, or Rinzai's if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him, kill the Buddhas and kill the patriarchs and kill the parents. Not so much. But it's important, as with, I think, all of these religious traditions, that we don't just look with such an utterly literal mind at these kinds of texts. Did Juzhi cut the boy's finger or not? Did Nansen cut the cat in two or not? These are great questions, and I've heard arguments on all sides. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. But we can't prove it one way or the other. And for our purposes in our Zen practice, it is not so important to prove it one way or the other, if we can grasp what's being pointed at in the case. So before we can talk about this case, we have to come to some understanding of our characters who are taking part in the case. As I always talk about when I'm talking about cases in this text, we have to take on the role. We have to become all of the characters in the case. Sometimes it takes some background. And Juzhi is a fascinating character. We don't know too much about Juzhi, actually. We know that he lived in around the 800s in China. He was a contemporary of Linji. We don't even know what his actual Dharma name was. Juzhi is a nickname, which is a section of a dharani, like a short dharani or a short mantra. Juzhi is a part of the mantra. And it's said that this monk recited this mantra so much that this Juzhi became his nickname. Everyone just knew him as Old Juzhi, the guy who's up there chanting Juzhi, Juzhi, Juzhi all the time. And it's said that Juzhi was a hermit, and he lived in a little cabin on the side of a mountain, and he did his hermit practice. So he set up a little garden around himself and hid himself up in the mountain, didn't come down, and maintained his practice of sitting meditation, chanting his dharani, and seeking after awakening in this way. Juzhi, in this case, in this story, this part of the story, represents a particular way of practice. And I think, my suspicion is that at some point in our lives, if we engage in practice, maybe even if we don't engage in this kind of formal meditation practice, we all end up in a place like Juzhi. For me, when I started practice, I practiced very much like Juzhi, just setting up my environment to the way that it pleased me, to the way that I felt would support my practice, and practicing in this way. I started to become more and more disenchanted with the world around me. I still had to work for a living, but I would go and do my job and just be more and more disgusted with society and with humans and with cities and with materialism and with all of these kinds of things. And I just couldn't wait to get back to my little apartment where I could have my little cushion and my little bujudan and all this kind of stuff. And I would sit there. For hours, I would just sit there. And I think it's actually quite a healthy practice. I always encourage people both to practice in a group, but to also develop their own practice, their own solitary practice at home. But one of the things that I've really seen is that when we only do this kind of solitary practice, we begin to become very lopsided. We begin to become very in our heads and philosophical. We become very spiritually fragile. In other words, if we were to set up in our little meditation hall and light our special candle and, sweep our little room so that it's all nice and perfect and light our little incense and sit ourselves down on the cushion for our spiritual practice, our meditation, and then the door knocks and we've got Jehovah's Witnesses at the door. We're like, shit! Go away! Don't you know? I'm trying to do my practice! Or if a little niece or nephew or grandkid comes to our house and they have a nice visit, and after they leave, we go into our little meditation room and, everything's all topsy-turvy. That little bastard! My sacred space! How could you do this? Or our world can become smaller and smaller. The things that upset us become greater and greater. The more things that offend our sensibilities, the list piles up until we just have to live in our little room. And we have to ask ourselves, if we find, actually we should ask ourselves this regardless of our practice. Is this practice that I'm engaged in making my heart more open? Is it making me more receptive? Or am I starting to become bitter, closing, hiding, avoiding? This is a question I'll leave you with to investigate. Juzhi had his hermitage on the mountain, and he had his little garden, and he had his little routine. In the morning I wake up and get a fire going, maybe make a cup of tea, do a little meditation. When the sun comes up, I'd start doing maybe some prostrations. Maybe I'd start reciting my mantra, go out to my garden, chant while I'm gardening. Maybe I'll have something to eat at lunch. And day in and day out, this routine happened. And Juzhi felt, yes, I'm completely in harmony with the Dharma. I'm completely on the path of awakening. I'm completely doing as I should. So the story goes that one night, Juzhi was in his hermitage, following his routine. Maybe he's finished chanting. These hermitages were traditionally 10 square feet. So there's Juzhi in the middle of his 10 square feet doing zazen. The birds are singing their evening songs and the wind is in the pines. When suddenly there's a stomping and a knock at the door. And just as he's opening his eyes, the door opens. The person hasn't even waited for him to come. And in steps a Zen nun, a female Zen monk. And she steps into the room as Juzhi sits there and walks around him in a clockwise fashion, not even taking off her hat. How rude. Walking around him 3 times, she stops in front of him and says, "Give me a turning word and I will take off my hat." In the Zen school, there can be only one way to understand this. This is a traveling monk who is looking for a challenge. So this is a monk who has done a significant amount of training and is now out in the world looking for people who have some kind of reputation and testing their own depth, testing their own character with those teachers. Now this particular, the story is, the name that they give to this monk, this priest, this female, it's particular that it's female, and I quite love it, is they give her the name Jisai in Japanese, which when you translate it means true world or real world. And so when you look at this koan as metaphor, you have Juzhi sitting in his hermitage and the real world walks in and interrupts him. Now I have a personal theory, because at this time, contemporary to Linji and Juzhi, there was a very famous Zen nun who was very famous for doing exactly this. Her name was Liu Teimo. Liu Tiemo. In Japanese, it's Ryu Tetsuma. And her name, Tetsuma, means iron grinder. And she was absolutely notorious for making these Zen guys look bad. So, anyways, coming back to our story, Liu Qiemo, or Jisai, the real world, walks around Juzhi 3 times, plants her feet in front of him. You have to sort of picture this scene, sitting in your little hermitage. The cold wind blows across you as the door comes in, and this shadowy figure with a broad hat begins circling you like a shark, stands in front of you and says, jingling her staff, "Say something and I'll take my hat off." What would you say? How would you respond to this challenge? Well, the story is that that's just exactly what Juzhi said. All of the years of practice, all of the study and all of the chanting and all of the gardening and all of the piety and all of the everything, in this moment, he's challenged. Say something! Just flabbergasted. So the story is that the real world circled him 3 more times. Maybe she thought, maybe he's hard of hearing, or maybe he's a little slow in the head. Well, we'll try again. So compassionately walks around him 3 times again, plants her feet in front of him and says, "If you give me a turning word, I'll take off my hat." And again, Juzhi is completely flabbergasted. Without even a pause or a beat, this nun turns on her heel and walks out the door into the night. Gathering up his senses, Juzhi runs to the door and says, "Wait, it's starting to get dark. Why don't you stay the night?" Spinning around, this nun says, "If you give me a turning word, I'll stay the night." Again, he is unable to answer. He doesn't know what she wants him to say. He doesn't know what he should say. What's the right thing to say in such a circumstance? Because he's unable to respond, the nun turns again and disappears down the mountain. How would you feel in this experience? This is a wonderful Zen exchange, and it's completely stereotypical or completely consistent with all of the stories of Liu Qiemo, the iron grinder. Without so much, in less than 3 minutes, I would say, Liu Qiemo has taken Juzhi's practice, his solidity in his practice, his confidence and surety in his practice, chewed him up and spit him out. And it's easy for me, especially, to think of this in a very kind of macho way. To think like, yeah, kick his butt. But the truth is, this is a very succinct and very compassionate way of interacting. There is no time wasted. And Juzhi is left completely sure that there's more practice to do. Juzhi plunks himself down in his cabin that night, completely filled with this feeling of inadequacy. All of these years of practice, I've been faithful to my tradition. I have done what the scriptures and the teachers have told me to do. And yet in a single moment, when the real world came calling, I couldn't so much as open my mouth to respond. That's it, he says. I'm leaving. I've got to leave this hermitage. It's not serving me. It's not helping my practice to develop. This isolation has got me. I've got to go. So that very night he packed up his belongings into his carrying pack and dozed over his pack, waiting for the dawn to come in the morning. And it said that night, it said different ways. That night, some say he had a dream. Some say that the mountain god, the deity that lived in the mountain in China at the time, all mountains had deities that lived in them. Lots of trees did too, and big rocks, waterfalls. But anyways, one way or the other, whether you like the dream, or whether you like the visiting spirit, he received this message: don't go. A Zen master will come soon and to teach you. And so in the morning, Juzhi unpacked his things and said, okay, I'll wait. And it said 2 days later, Qianlong showed up at the hermitage. And Juzhi was very happy and, made some tea and sat him down and said, oh, great, I have this story to tell you. And he proceeds to tell Qianlong the story. He says, what should I have said? How should I have responded? And Qianlong says, ask. So we've talked about this even in the last case, this turning things around. So here we have the Qianlong says, ask. So this means, let's play. Let's do this. So you be the real world and I will be Juzhi. So ask. So Juzhi says, give me a turning word and I will take off my hat. Qianlong replies, and Juzhi has this profound awakening. Is it the magic in the finger? How else could Qianlong have replied? How might Rinzai have replied? Hoots! Huangbo might have hit him. Pow! It's not in the finger. It's not in the shout. It's not in the blow. How do you respond when your real life surrounds you like a shark and demands of you, give me a turning word? How do you respond? Stumbling over ourselves and what would be right, what would be wrong, what should I do, what could I do, what's the Buddhist thing to do, and already the real world has stormed off into the night like a passing cloud. So we have the character of Juzhi here. Juzhi eventually becomes a great teacher. The mechanism or the pattern or the archetype that is displayed in this story is so wonderful. The dark night of the soul, it's called, in the West. After the real world has left, completely upending everything in Juzhi's life, he has this crisis. But it's a real realization that there's further to go. I can go deeper. And in many ways, this event has to happen in our spiritual practice. And oftentimes in the old days, half of me wonders if Qianlong didn't send Juzhi or send Liu Qiemo along ahead. Go upend him, and then I'll finish the job. Who knows? But that upending and that poking the, it's like a ripened boil or something like this, and Qianlong just lances it. Awakening. So we come to this case, this experience, this teaching that Qianlong gives Juzhi apparently impacts him deeply, and it reverberates for the rest of Juzhi's life. Because in the beginning of this case it says, whenever Juzhi was asked a question, he simply raised one finger. Now, I'm sure it was like, do you want a cup of tea? Juzhi didn't say, or maybe he did, one cup of tea. Have you eaten your breakfast? But I think we're to understand that whenever Juzhi was asked a question about the Dharma, about how this practice works, about how to go about manifesting this activity, he would demonstrate just through this simple device complete manifestation, fully coming into this activity of raising a finger. Every one of us here can try this. So everybody just try to just raise and extend one finger. Completely embodying the raising of a finger. And even you can do a self-assessment. Did I actually completely raise that finger? Where was my mind? Was I thinking, how silly? Was I embarrassed to do it? Was I able to completely put my whole body, heart, and mind into the activity of raising a finger? It's a good practice. You could also do that planting your garden, cooking your breakfast, washing your dishes. How do you manifest Juzhi's finger in doing this? But you can't play act it. I shouldn't say that. That's my own pet peeve. You can't pretend. This is clever Zen. I get people who have read a lot of books and you say, so what do you know about Buddhism? And they'd go, and this is the case. Whenever Juzhi was asked a question, he simply raised one finger. One day, a visitor asked Juzhi's attendant what his master preached. Now, the way that I was told this story was maybe Juzhi was off begging in town. Maybe he was off visiting a donor. Maybe he was away from the temple, and his attendant was left in charge of the temple. And a visitor came and said, "Oh, I've heard this is the temple of Juzhi. I'd like to speak to the master." And the attendant said, "Oh, well, the master is not here." And he says, "Oh, well, are you his attendant?" "Yes." "Okay, well, surely you know his teaching, so maybe you could share his profound teaching with me." And the attendant goes, "Oh, right on, this is my chance." So he goes back to the master's room and gets the master's robe and sits in the master's chair and says, "Okay, ask." And the guest says, well, he could ask any question. Why did Bodhidharma come from the West? What is the true way of Buddha? Any of these questions. And the attendant says, maybe the traveler is baffled. Or maybe the traveler says, "Wow, that was amazing!" Either way, the traveler leaves. And when the Master Juzhi comes back, he notices maybe his robes aren't the way that he left them, and he says to his attendant, what happened? And so the attendant tells him. My suspicion is that when the attendant begins to tell the story or tells the story, Juzhi says, okay, show me. Meaning, let's turn this around. And he says, why does Bodhidharma come from the west? And the attendant, now playing Juzhi, raises his finger, but doesn't quite make it. Ha! Now, whether he cuts his finger off, hits it with a stick, even hits it with a hand, or even just with his voice, ha! Makes it clear, both in fact maybe flips it just as he was flipped. The attendant's confidence completely undermined, recognizes that he is doing an imitation. Maybe he cuts his finger off to demonstrate. Either way, the attendant, in pain, emotional pain, physical pain, humiliation pain, existential pain, runs screaming from the room. And as he reaches the doorway, Juzhi says, "Attendant, Inji!" The attendant turns around out of duty, and Juzhi says, "Pow." The attendant has a realization. And how wonderful that this transmission from the master to the student continues. When Juzhi was about to die, laying on his deathbed, he said to his assembled monks, "I received this one finger Zen from Tianlong. I used it all my life, but never used it up." With this, he entered into his eternal rest. I really love this statement. I never used it up. The way that I always like to paraphrase this is like, I used it all my life and it never got old. This is something that I often see in Zen, particularly in the Rinzai tradition. Rinzai's shout. In all of the shouting, it can get boring. It can get cliche. It can get old. Too stinky. Too Zen. Too bombastic. And yet I find I don't do it so much, but when I do it, I try to do it wholeheartedly. I try to manifest the unspeakable, the undescribable, the absolute in a shout. And when I'm able to catch it, when I'm able to disappear into the shout, it somehow manifests without cliche. It never gets old. It's a powerful tool of demonstration, and it catches. It speaks to our hearts more than 1,000 words and more than 1,000 gestures, just this shout. I think that each of us has to find our own way. We may be able to demonstrate through a musical instrument, or we may be able to demonstrate through a hug, We may be able to demonstrate through the way we set a table, through the way that we drive a car. We may be able to demonstrate through the way that we just interact with the simple inanimate objects in our everyday life. I've seen this many times. How a person dries dishes, where you're just actually taken aback. How can you be taken aback by how somebody dries dishes? It's just Juzhi's finger. Wumen, our old friend, says, the awakening of Juzhi and the boy has nothing to do with the end of a finger. If you realize this, then Chanlong Juzhi, the boy, and you yourself are all run through with a single skewer. And this is what's so important about practicing with koans, is understanding that this isn't just about these old Chinese people. When we practice a koan, we have to transfigure. We have to become a part of the activity. We have to become the player in the activity. We have to become the activity itself. When we're able to witness the principle, the case, when we're able to experience it in our heart, we are practicing koans. When we're able to experience this, then indeed, as it says in the first case, our eyebrows entangle with the eyebrows of the masters, seeing with one eye and hearing with one ear. Or we're run through with a single skewer. This is a principle or a metaphor or image that Wumen comes back to over and over again. Unification. It's not 1,000 truths. It is one awakening. Wumen's verse says, Chanlong made a fool of old Juzhi, who cut the boy with a sharp blade. Chanlong is this teacher, demonstrating just one way that was strong enough or deep enough or clear enough that Juzhi took it up and used it almost in isolation for his whole life. This fool Wumen is a joker. He's ironic. And in the flavor of our tradition, the fool is the man who has nothing. The fool is the man who can twist and turn and manifest in unpredictable ways. The fool is the awakened one. It's the king or the emperor, the deity. They have so many limitations, so many expectations, so many requirements, that whenever you hear somebody referred to as a fool, a joker, an ass, a fox, all of these things, we have to understand that our conventional mind will often sort of like discard that and say like, oh, what a fool. But in the Zen tradition, for the old Zen masters, I get to be the fool. It's very much, if you ever read Shakespeare, the fool is always the character to watch. The wise fool. They're always the one with insight into the situation that nobody seems to take seriously. Nobody seems to heed. Just as the deity Zhuling raised his hands and Huashan with its many ridges split in two. This is a reference to an old legend about a mountain in China. There was an area on one side of the mountain that was very dry and a big lake on the other side of the mountain. And the deity wanted the water to get to the people in the lower area. And so he cut the mountain in two, and that's the story of this river coming through the mountain down into the lower. Likewise, Juzhi, there is this body of wisdom, this experience of awakening, the minus, the absolute, and we have the experience of plus the material, the active. It's all one world. It's all one life. It's all ours. But we set up this mountain range sometimes in between those two things. Juzhi himself was unable to manage the mountains when he was asked by Jisai, real world, or if my suspicions are correct, Liu Tiemo. He was unable to manage the mountain passage from absolute wisdom to manifestation, to demonstration. Chanlong, with just his finger, broke that mountain for Juzhi. Likewise, Juzhi, for his attendant, with a knife or with his voice, cut the mountain in two and allowed that clarity, that freshness, that nourishment of the absolute flow into the demonstration of subjective manifestation. So the question, the case, how do you manifest? If we were to turn this story around, how do you manifest? What is it that Juzhi is demonstrating?
Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.